And good afternoon. Welcome to a special edition of NAC Minutes. Figured this might be a nice opportunity. Had a little bit of extra time this afternoon to go over some of the things that I had intended to cover more fully last Tuesday. I appreciate you all bearing with me with some of the personal issues that I had that caused me to cut the broadcast short. But certainly I have a pregnant wife who, if she needs my attention, that becomes a little bit more important than a live broadcast. I posted 2 links on Facebook. I'm not too sure which one works better than the other one. I'm thinking the most recent one that I posted, which is a link to the actual YouTube channel, might end up being a little bit more easier to use there. But if you have any other troubles or any problems that you're experiencing during the broadcast, please feel free to let me know. You never know if I have a microphone muted or not, or anything of that nature. And hopefully, again, this time around, you hopefully were able to listen to some of the intro music that is brought to you by AJ McQuay of After Osmosis, dear brother in Christ, who was kind enough to write intro music for the NAC Minutes broadcast. So again, another special thank you to AJ McQuay. A lot of hard work, a lot of time, a lot of effort that he put into making something that I really think is a good representation of the mood and the feel of the NAC Minutes broadcast. So very excited about that, very appreciative of him being able to provide that to us. I did want to start off with something. Many of you know that part of the catalyst that launched me into doing this is a part of my desire to expose some of the King James only argumentation that I've been receiving via email from a brother in the Lord, and about 800 plus emails, maybe even closer to 900 now. I haven't done an official count recently, but a huge email chain and an email exchange between the two of us on the King James Version, and not what you would think with respect to the King James Version. Is it a good translation? Is it accurate? Those kinds of things. But when it comes to King James onlyism, it's the belief, it's the understanding that the King James Version is the best, and you're disadvantaged by using anything else. This is specifically this brother's position. And because of that, the fact that I would use something different than the King James Version on a regular basis, though I actually do appreciate the King James Version, that this brother feels the need to criticize using any other translation. It's very, very fantastic and fascinating and riveting email discussion. But our first broadcast, we went over some of the reasons why I don't think it's the best translation. And in future broadcasts, I'd like to go over why I don't necessarily think any specific translation by itself will end up being the best translation. But wanted to give you an update on what's been happening between me and this brother via email. The conversation has degraded as if it were super exciting as of late anyway, into Trump apologetics from this brother. And yes, I do mean none other than Republican political candidate Donald J. Trump. This brother believes that every Christian everywhere should be voting for Trump, as many Christians do believe that, and as many Christians would be voting for him. And apparently, since I am an undecided voter, having not been swayed or persuaded in any way, shape, or form to vote for Donald Trump at this point in time, this brother has taken it upon himself to convince me of every reason why it is that I should vote for Trump. To which part of what I had wanted to give the update on our conversation and reveal that information to you all is hopefully in video form that many of you may be able to hear very clearly, very specifically regarding my position with respect to the current political circus. I think is probably a good way to put it, that I am an undecided voter, and I am waiting for the opportunity to see some kind of substantial reason to vote for Donald Trump. And for Christians that believe so strongly to vote for Trump, I understand. I respect that. I don't have any specific issue to try to argue with you or to sway your opinion as to why you're voting for Trump. But at the same time, I would expect the same level of respect to be given to somebody like me that is looking for substance, is looking for real reasons to vote for Trump that match or that are at least consistent enough with my Christian worldview that would convince me to vote for him. And every time, brothers and sisters in the Lord that are pro-Trump, every time that we would have a conversation, or hopefully that you would have a conversation with any other Christian, remember you're Christians first. Regardless of what's going to happen with this election, it's clear in my mind that, as some people have sort of said jokingly, but in some way seriously, everybody loses, regardless of the outcome of this election. But I understand his rhetoric, Trump's rhetoric. I understand the platform that he is running on. I've heard the argumentations from fellow Christians who imbibe Trump and who regurgitate the rhetoric. I understand what he has said, what has come across in the news regarding what he thinks he's going to do, what he plans to do as a presidential candidate. And I just don't see any substance, any significant reality in what Trump is saying and what he plans to do and how he plans to accomplish that. And then I just don't think that somebody who is so hardcore pro-choice to the point of partial birth abortion, who flip-flopped to a pro-life position, is a champion now of the pro-life position. I just don't see how you flip-flop from one issue, and that's evidence of a person and their ability to champion a pro-life agenda. Certainly not with respect to a moral view of marriage. Somebody who has been divorced so many times, who is engaged in polyamorous relationships, who I think has even in some degrees boasted about affairs that he has had. I don't think he's really a champion of what I would consider moral marriage, Christian marriage, anything that would allow the sanctity of marriage to continue as it had in America. So I understand some problems that are there. But again, to convince me, as this brother is attempting to do via email, that I have to vote for Trump because he is the Christian candidate, because he has all of these conservative views that he has not held before, and that's proof, that's evidence that he would be the right candidate to vote for. I don't need the continual rhetoric, what I already know, to be spewed at me again and again and again. I understand it. I know it. I can read the news. I can watch the news. I can listen to the news for myself. I wish the arguments were this: we absolutely do not want Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton with the Supreme Court would be horrible. And we are recognizing the immorality of Donald Trump. We are not attempting to do what some Christian leaders like Wayne Grudem has done, where he's capitulated to say he's a good candidate with flaws. It's a lot worse than that. These are just merely flaws. Concepts about Trump that Christians under Bill Clinton's presidency would have not stood for Bill Clinton's immorality. But in the face of Hillary Clinton, the immorality of Trump is something to be overlooked, something to be ignored, or perhaps even defended. And that's what disgusts me. So again, the argumentation that I find appealing is to say, here it is, we don't want Hillary Clinton with the Supreme Court because there are other branches of government that this nation has. And so to say, don't want that, would prefer Trump, would prefer a good appointment of a Supreme Court justice under a Trump presidency, assuming he knows how to nominate the right candidate, which may be the case because I do appreciate Mike Pence as a VP. We want a Republican Senate, and those are the things that we would vie for, and that we would have the hope of Trump amassing advisors around himself, because I think he would end up being a puppet president. But that's the hope, that's the goal, is really shooting for a lot of optimism, and to say that's the primary and really only specific reason to vote for Trump. I appreciate that more than what some Christians have done in conversation with me, which has defended Trump to the point of him almost being elevated to a status of a political messiah. That not only is it just we don't want Hillary, but we want Trump because he is the one that's going to change the course of this nation. And as, again, the imbibing of Trump rhetoric is going to make America great again. Come on. There is no substantiation for those claims that he's even given, let alone that is a testimony that he has demonstrated in any way, shape, or form. But so as an encouragement to brothers and sisters in the Lord, you are Christians first. The gospel is more important. You are citizens in a kingdom whose ruler is fixed and set. And that ruler is Jesus Christ, who rules from his throne, who, regardless of what happens in this nation, of what other freedoms that Christians specifically would lose, whatever comforts and things of that nature could be taken away from us, any kind of persecution that would happen to Christians because of either candidacy, either presidency, we're Christians first, and our citizenship and our permanent residence in heaven cannot be taken away by this election. And certainly that if there are Christians that are proactive in a political setting, that there's still work to be done. There's still work that can be done. And so we wouldn't roll over and play dead necessarily, but at the same time, we understand that much of what's happening in our world is clear testimony of a judgment of God that is being placed upon this nation. And it is what it is at that point. But we as Christians, looking at the judgment of God throughout the Old Testament and the fact that the remnant was not the recipients of the judgment. They may have experienced it in their environments, but they went through it unscathed and came out rejoicing and worshiping God. And I would expect that the New Testament elect, the New Testament remnant, would experience that in the very same way in our nation. And so we trust God. We trust that no matter what happens is the right thing in His eyes, which could be for judgment or for repentance. And there's that. So, but again, you've seen it on Facebook, you've seen it on social media, you've seen the way Christians can very easily be at each other's throat because of this. And I think for this individual who's a very older gentleman than me, who he's held on to Republican values, to concepts of how people have traditionally understood that to be synonymous with Christianity, and I wish that it was totally the case, but it's hard to really say that that's genuinely the case throughout recent U.S. history. But to equate the two as the same thing, that really, if you're a Christian, that means you must vote Republican, which in this sense means you must vote Trump. And if Christians are genuinely troubled and bothered by that, they have not doomed the nation by wanting to vote for a different candidate. I know Ted Cruz got booed off the stage for saying vote your conscience. My encouragement is vote your worldview. And as a Christian, vote a Christian worldview. And voting within a Christian worldview means certainly not violating one's conscience. And I appreciate the Christians who feel the ability to be able to vote for Trump, and I may actually end up doing that if there's something from now until November that demonstrates to me enough of a significant reason in the totality of U.S. government to vote for somebody that is a moral cesspool. Then I would be happy to do so. I've been given the rhetoric: we're not voting for a pastor, we're voting for a president. Yes, but the last person that I would expect to be pro whoever is Donald Trump, and all of the moral problems and blemishes that exist in his worldview and in his mindset. So I get it. We're not voting for a pastor. Never thought that I was. Issues that I take with Trump are beyond a pastoral qualification, as if I'm reading one of the pastoral epistles and I'm seeing the qualifications of elders and I'm saying, well, clearly Donald Trump does not look like an elder, does not look like a pastor according to the Bible. That's not the issue. So let's focus on the real problems of the kind of an individual that we would prefer as a president. And that's certainly not the case in the candidacy of Donald Trump, at least at this time. Again, be more than happy to follow the news for myself. I'm an educated individual. I can make decisions and discernment on a particular issue. So you can trust that if your candidate, Donald Trump, is the candidate that I should be voting for, I'll come around. I'll come around, and I won't have to be convinced by the Trump apologists who want me to vote for Trump on the basis of the same empty rhetoric that I already am aware of. But if he's a strong candidate, if he's a convincing candidate, and if you genuinely believe that his platform is enough to cause people to vote for him, then I'll come around. You don't have to sweat that. I have not initiated Armageddon by my current position on Trump. So I love you brothers and sisters that are pro-Trump advocates, that are Trump apologists, and have no problem with you individuals personally. I'm not offended by you individuals personally, but seriously, it's just crazy that there would be such intense level of argumentation over the worst concepts of making a political decision that I have ever personally seen in my life. Let's figure out how that kind of a backdrop shines the gospel even further when even political candidates fail. Our Savior does not. And maybe this is a wonderful way for God to continue growing his church, even amongst the depravity of the nation, which, as Spurgeon said, a diamond shines its brightest when pitted against a black surface. Well, guess what, dear brothers and sisters in Christ? The black surface is going to be perhaps the blackest that it has been. And now is the time to get our evangelism planned and executed, and to see the gospel shine when it's this dark. Maybe that becomes more of a priority than regurgitating political propaganda and political rhetoric. Maybe that is something that we should all focus on. But there it is. So I wanted to give you an update on that, and now would like to take the opportunity to return back to looking at the 5 love languages. Perhaps for many of us, a subject matter far more riveting than politics, and maybe far more beneficial to us than politics, for sure. So just a recap on some of the things that we had introduced as part of our disclaimer. The idea of love languages is not something that I disagree with, but is something that I do find beneficial. And not that everything in the book, The 5 Love Languages, is something that every Christian needs to take and put on a bonfire and burn it as heretical. I think there are some beneficial things to reading the book, but as I mentioned last time, I think there's just some fluff that is kind of difficult to get through in order to find the pearls, in order to find the gold within this book. And again, you know, if you've read this book and it's something that you found to be beneficial, great. You know, maybe this is helpful in perhaps sanctifying some of the truths that are in it, so that way we see it in a greater playing field on a more transcendent level than perhaps you saw before. And then maybe in interacting with these things, it might provide you with some benefit with respect to your lives, your marriages, and you know, maybe it motivates you even more. And as another qualification, as another disclaimer, when you hear concepts like the love tank, and you'll see here in a moment of the origin of how that doctrine came about, I think a lot of times Christians hear illustrations that perhaps they may not make sense necessarily because it's not biblical vocabulary, and I appreciate that. But certainly when there's an illustration that is used, like the love tank, if it's helpful to think in terms of a love tank or a love language, then great. But certainly we need to look at that from a more transcendent perspective of what is really going on with the anthropology of a person, and then what is really going on with theology in terms of that person's relationship to God, duty, and obligation to him, especially within the context and the confines of marriage, and how the dynamics of those illustrations play out, and how those dynamics of the illustration have been used by Gary Chapman and others. You know, again, it's not that we're trying to draw things to a logical conclusion to try to just simply criticize something for the sake of criticism, or argue about something for the sake of argument, but it's in examining things that have been genuine applications of that by the pioneers of the doctrine, in which case it's beneficial to avoid those concepts, regardless of whether or not we take the dynamics or the instructions of the love languages and apply those to our marriages. It's just simply when we look at some of the problems with the book and we are honest about them, that we can kind of sift through those and move those off to the side as something that we don't accept, that instead we would reject, and then be able to focus on some great things. But the principle behind the love tank and many other illustrations that psychiatrists and psychologists have used, some of the principles are not far off from a Christian worldview, but they may be distracting in terms of their terminology or lack of biblical vocabulary, and so that's certainly understandable. But let's return back over here to the book, The 5 Love Languages. And I've got a Logos edition, so if I give out page numbers, like for example, you can see here in the upper left-hand corner, I'm on page 9. Sometimes the Logos page numbers sort of get a little goofy and messed up. I've even seen that with Kindle, where the Kindle books may not necessarily be as accurate with respect to chapters or locations as a physical hard copy would be. So bear in mind that this is genuinely in the book, The 5 Love Languages. This is, I'm reading it, but it is an electronic edition, and so there may be some extra work of having to try to find the specific pages. But you'll notice here, though, I'm right before chapter 1, so it'd be hard to misunderstand where I'm at specifically here. But we had talked about last time that Dr. Chapman, Dr. Gary Chapman, the author of the book, The 5 Love Languages, that I have up on my screen here. You can see here the author, Gary Chapman, and this is the Logos edition. The author of this book, Dr. Chapman, has credited several psychiatrists for influencing his concepts of love. We talked about the issues of Dr. Scott Peck, and then I had mentioned that Ross Campbell is, I think, a more significant influence perhaps to Dr. Chapman than perhaps Swihart or Dr. Peck, primarily because especially the idea of the love tank originates with Ross Campbell. Dr. Campbell is a child psychiatrist, and the way that he comes up with the concept of the love tank, I think, is a disappointing thing. But again, you can take it or leave it as something that you find either as a criticism or something that you might think as being a little bit more impressive than I think that it is. But Dr. Campbell had been away, and he talks about this in his book, How to Really Love Your Child. I believe it's page 104. And in his book, he was recounting the fact that he had gone away on a business trip, and when he came back, his children were misbehaving and fighting with each other. And he concludes something that is a good conclusion, that he had not been involved as much in his kids' lives, and he sees a connection between their behavior and his involvement, which of course is a thoroughly observable pattern within the lives of parents and children. Certainly noticeable more perhaps when one parent is absent or both parents are absent, that perhaps the behavior is being determined by the involvements or the presence of a paternal or maternal influence within a child's life. And so his solution to the problem was spending more time with his children, and you have to commend him for that. There's nothing that is inherent to psychology or psychiatry to that. There's nothing that contradicts a biblical worldview to recognize that the involvement that parents have with their children affects and influences their children either positively or negatively. But so as he's experiencing this and as he's reasoning through these problems, he looks at his children and he says, you know what? I think that both of my kids probably have a love tank, and this love tank has a perpetual leak in it, and they're misbehaving because their love tank was empty. and boom, there is the doctrine of the love tank. So again, I look at that and I say, well, there's not this like thorough examination of scientific principles or biblical concepts. I mean, there's a lot that's ultimately lacking. You could argue, I suppose, from his years of experience in schooling and study and actual observance of children over the course of time. But in the moment of the discovery of the love tank, it's my kids are misbehaving. It's my fault. I haven't filled up their love tanks. Kind of disappoints me a little bit. It's not like you're given a thorough exegesis of Scripture. It's not like you're given this fantastic insight to the use of a Greek term in contemporaneous literature in the first century to give an insight as to why the biblical authors use that word, why the Holy Spirit inspired that word, but that it's essentially, my two kids are fighting, I was away on business, their love tanks are empty because there's this perpetual leak, and therefore I need to fill it up, but I need to fill it up with my children's love languages. So again, we don't have to be overtly nitpicky or critical of some of these things. So if you see that and you say, well, maybe it's helpful to instruct people that may not grasp the significance of having a constant involvement in their children's lives or a constant involvement in their spouses' lives, because that ends up becoming one of the applications of Dr. Campbell's findings. Maybe since that's maybe a difficult concept for some to grasp, that it's helpful to paint a word picture for them and say, imagine if there were a love tank inside somebody and that tank was leaking, and the only thing that you could do is continually fill that tank up with whatever substance is supposed to be in that tank, and which then requires your constant involvement, your constant care, your constant interaction to make sure that that love tank is full. Okay. If that's helpful to motivate you and to get you to recognize the significance of it in terms of what should be happening on an ongoing basis from parents to children and spouses to spouse, I can understand that. I certainly look at that and I think perhaps that could be distracting to the ultimate transcendent motivation of being involved in children's lives from a biblical perspective is you are commanded to do so. To raise your children in the Lord, and that their misbehavior, again, this is where it went back to why we introduced anthropology in the first place and why Scott Peck, as an evolutionary atheist, might miss a proper conclusion of how people should be interacting with each other. Because if you fundamentally misunderstand anthropology, you'll make mistakes on how humans should be loving each other and interacting with each other. But so there's a missing of that, and then their misbehavior is disciplinable within the Scripture. And in fact, the Scriptures teach that a person genuinely does not love their children that does not discipline their children. So you see the clashes in the worldviews with respect to the definitions of love when the biblical instruction and the biblical admonition for love of a child is defined by disciplining misbehavior. Whereas a materialistic secular worldview would say it's the fault of the parents for not pouring love into them. Now again, I think pouring love into a child is good. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. I don't think anybody would miss that. But how does a person continue to pour in love and to continue to pour in love to their children of a transcendent value and a transcendent nature? Well, biblically speaking, in the biblical worldview, that includes discipline, because their misbehavior is also known as sin. And as a Christian worldview would recognize, as the Bibles teach, as God himself has decreed and declared, that every person, because of Adam's sin, is born sinful, fully capable of committing any particular sin. And so they are of their own nature going to sin, and that sinful disposition is enhanced by either a lack of quality of influence in the children's lives, pouring the gospel into your children, as well as an absence of any influence at all, any positive influence at all. If the positive influence is completely missed and absent, then it's going to fuel the problem that already exists, and that's they're sinful. But that's the origin of the love tank, and that's what Dr. Chapman had received from Dr. Campbell. Listening to him, I believe even in a conference is where Dr. Chapman had first heard the concept of the love tank, and then took that opportunity to apply that to marriages, that the same must be true out of marriages as it would be for parents to children. Because as we scroll down here, may have a highlighted definition of his understanding of anthropology, that human beings are born with an inherent need of love, and that confirms the idea that there's a love tank within each of us that needs to be filled up, because every single one of us has an inherent need to be loved. Keeping the love tank full. Now, I've highlighted here at the beginning of this chapter, this is chapter 2, the founder of the Christian faith wanted love to be the distinguishing characteristic of his followers. And then he has a footnote here of John 13:35. By all this, people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. And then here it is. Psychologists have concluded that the need to feel loved is a primary human emotional need. And then going into the Apostle Paul here, he gives this quote that he concluded that in the last scene of the human drama, only 3 characters will remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love, as he is quoting from 1 Corinthians 13 here. Well, again, there's huge context pertaining to those that don't just simply reduce the teachings of Christ. Why don't you just simply say Jesus here? I'm not sure. You're able to name Paul, the Christian apostle to the Gentiles, but for some reason the founder of the Christian faith is somebody whose name is not important to include in this specific section. That's rather strange, especially from somebody that I've understood was a pastor or a leader within the Christian church, like Dr. Chapman was, or is. But it's appreciated. A few of these others, child psychologists affirm that every child has certain basic emotional needs that must be met if he is to be emotionally stable. So here's where the jargon comes into play. Here's where the psychology, that's one of the reasons why up here earlier I had highlighted sometimes the answers are couched in psychological research jargon that is almost incomprehensible. It's ironic because then Dr. Chapman incorporates psychological jargon in this presentation here. Child psychologists affirm that every child has certain basic emotional needs that must be met if he is to be emotionally stable. Among those emotional needs, none is more basic than the need for love and affection, the need to sense that he or she belongs and is wanted. With an adequate supply of affection, the child will likely develop into a responsible adult. Without that love, he or she will be emotionally and socially retarded. So, again, if you really want to say, well, Jeremy, you're nitpicking things, you're criticizing a little bit too much, that's fine. But the idea of emotional stability being based upon meeting emotional needs, there's an absence of a Christian anthropology that is a part of what I guess could be considered an emotional stability would be brought about by biblical concepts. And that the problems of children that interact with a destabilizing of an emotionality are reduced back to sinful problems that require disciplinary action. And yet I don't think I have found, maybe it's in his book, The 5 Love Languages for Children, but in this book where he talks about children and their experiences with needing the love tank to be full and their emotional needs being met, where that's a foundation for marriages and how they should interact as a husband and a wife, that in recognizing what is not being said and what is missing from this, then again, that's where the issue comes into play, where you're missing out on experiencing perhaps parenting even on a transcendent level, a level which glorifies God, enjoys God, and is thoroughly capable of experiencing a greater sense of reality. And that's an important principle, that's an important concept to bear in mind and to keep in mind as we go through this. The green highlight here, much of the misbehavior of children is motivated by the cravings of an empty love tank. I was listening to Dr. Ross Campbell, a psychiatrist who specializes in the treatment of children and adolescents, which of course, there's a capitulation with respect to psychology and psychiatry. You have almost 3 stages of growing up. You have children, adolescents, and adults, and yet from a biblical perspective, you have children and adults. And so you have this creation of a category of people who need to go from being children to experiencing some sense of adolescence, and then from there are capable of becoming adults based upon what's experienced there. And you really begin to prolong immaturity and prolong the ability of people to transition sooner into being capable and able adults. And so you're pushing immaturity further into the development of humanity. So again, you have this issue on the anthropology, but there it is. There's this empty love tank and misbehavior being attributed to the emptiness of that love tank, when the reality exists that certainly that does not help, and that fuels the problem of having an empty love tank of misbehavior. But there's no recognition of the sinful issues that thoroughly contribute to a child's misbehavior, to their acting out. Now, here's a fantastic example that I'm glad he included in this, of where not having the biblical anthropology applied, not having an understanding of sin is applied, and where you can end up blame shifting because of the understanding of the 5 love languages needing to fill up an empty love tank that would spare people from essentially sinning. He has this example here of this young woman named Ashley, 13 years of age, was being treated for a sexually transmitted disease. Her parents were crushed. They were angry with Ashley. They were upset with the school, which they blamed for teaching her about sex. Why would she do this, they asked. At the heart of mankind's existence is the desire to be intimate and to be loved by another. Marriage is designed to meet the need for intimacy and love. I appreciate that. But notice this highlighted section here in red. In my conversation with Ashley, she told me of her parents' divorce. And when she was 6 years old, quote, I thought my father left because he didn't love me, end quote. She said, quote, when my mother remarried when I was 10, I felt she now had someone to love her, but I still had no one to love me. I wanted so much to be loved. I met this boy at school. He was older than me, but he liked me. I couldn't believe it. He was kind to me, and in a while, I really felt he loved me. I didn't want to have sex, but I wanted to be loved. Ashley, end quote, Ashley's, quote, love tank, end quote, had been empty for many years. Her mother and stepfather had provided for her physical needs, but had not realized the deep emotional struggle raging inside her. They certainly loved Ashley, and they thought that she felt their love, not until it was almost too late that they discovered that they were not speaking Ashley's primary love language. So here you got this tragic example of a 13-year-old who, in the course of a disrupted family, by virtue of divorce, she's in a position where she's not feeling loved, and her mother remarries, and in the course of time, she sees her mom as being able to have her love tank filled, her love being met, her need to be loved being met, I should say. And because she has an empty love tank, she meets a boy, this older boy, and he gives her things that she apparently is craving and she needs. He was kind to me, and in a while I really felt he loved me. I didn't want to have sex, but I wanted to be loved. So you see in this example how it is that the doctrine of the 5 love languages, from Gary Chapman's perspective, and the doctrine of the love tank specifically, are being used in a way that is contradictory to a Christian worldview and to what the scriptures ultimately teach. This is fornication. This is a sexual sin that she committed. And, you know, she's making the statement here, I didn't want to have sex, but really, if you're in a position where you are not wanting sex, but it's happening, I mean, there's some serious questions about is that being forced? Are you being coerced into it? I mean, what's the specifics behind that? But the reality is that she engaged in it, and if it's not rape, it was a willing issue, and that's because of sin. And so sin is now actually being masked as an empty love tank. And really the problem ends up happening because her parents, who have a fundamentally different relationship with her than the relationship she experiences with this boy, even her step-parents, her stepdad and her mom, it's their issue. It was too late. Not until it was almost too late did they discover that they were not speaking Ashley's primary love language. And so she ended up doing this. She ended up pursuing sin, not because she's inherently sinful, and that there perhaps isn't even a Christian worldview that is being given to her. Perhaps the gospel's not even being preached to her, and how the gospel mends and heals the situation, though not on the issues of the physics of incurring an STD, but certainly the ability to cope and to live with that is something that the gospel provides. That's healing that the gospel provides. But you have this dismissal of sinful activity, this dismissal of the problems associated with that kind of activity, the fact that it's not an excuse, that because her parents were not supplying her love language with respect to how parents relate to their children, being a different relationship than how a 13-year-old relates to an older boy who takes interest in her and they have sex. It's a fundamentally different expression of love. And so how are those two concepts of love equated? That for her to feel loved and to feel loved so badly from her parents, that then she turns to find it in the wrong place. I don't mean to be cliche in that, but she looks for love in the wrong place. And that it's this, you sort of have this shifting of blame that ends up being placed upon her parents because she is not having her love tank filled up by her parents. This is another quote here in chapter 2. From Plato to Peck, writers have emphasized the importance of love in marriage, and certainly that could be the case, but I don't think that Dr. Peck has an understanding of marriage that is consistent with a Christian worldview and what believers would understand. Another quoted section here, highlighted section here, I should say. Could it be that deep inside hurting couples exists an invisible emotional love tank with its gauge on empty? Could the misbehavior, withdrawal, harsh words, and critical spirit occur because of that empty love tank? If we could find a way to fill it, could the marriage be reborn? With a full tank, would couples be able to create an emotional climate where it is possible to discuss differences and resolve conflicts? Could that tank be the key that makes marriage work? Well, of course, the gospel is the key that ultimately makes marriage work. What people have in terms of their marriages not ending up in divorce from a non-Christian worldview can certainly be pragmatism, but I think you could miss the enjoyment and the transcendent enjoyment of marriage by not seeing marriage work in a biblical framework, which defines marriage, demonstrates what marriage actually is, what it's for, what the purpose of it is, and how it would ultimately seek and glorify and honor God, and grant the opportunity and the ability for Christians to experience a higher quality of marriage. But again, you'll notice the questions that are being asked here: misbehavior, withdrawal, harsh words, critical spirit. Those could be the result of pride, sinful issues, idolatry, a great number of other specific reasons that cause people to engage in critical spirit or harsh words. So there's some things that are being missed. Now, again, if you look at that and you say, well, what it's really instructing me is the fact that I need to be more intentional in my marriage. I need to be more diligent in my marriage. I need to pour more of myself into my spouse, then great. And I think as a part of being able to achieve that in a greater degree, in a transcendent view, then the gospel of Jesus Christ, which is a message about marriage, because it's the idea of Jesus coming to die upon the cross to redeem his bride. He thoroughly gave himself up for his bride and for her benefit and for her to thrive on a greater playing field, on a greater plane, than to have left her exactly where she was. And so if we really granted the benefit of the doubt that Gary Chapman is talking about things that relate to a Christian worldview, he's only giving one side of the coin. Because my involvement or lack of involvement in my spouse's life is not an excuse for her to be disrespectful, to misbehave, to withdraw, to have a critical spirit. I know that if I were to not speak my wife's primary love language, or to not be as intentional in the marriage, or to not be as focused in the marriage, that that doesn't help the situation. That hurts the situation quite a bit. But the biblical commands that are given to husbands and wives are given to them for them to be personally responsible before the Lord to fulfill their roles as God commanded and intended them to fulfill it, irrespective of whether or not their spouses are fulfilling theirs. And when you look at it from the perspective that God is glorified when we are obeying him, when we are functioning as he has intended us to function, then you have a greater motivation for participating in the marriage in a way that is meaningful and transcendent and glorifies the Lord and grants enjoyment and contentment and satisfaction with a person. There's a greater means of achieving that for somebody who focuses upon God first and his pleasure of our activity, and not determining our behavior or our actions on the basis of what somebody else in our marriage, our counterpart, our spouse, is or is not doing. Now, of course, having said that, it is important to recognize how you can relieve the burden that exists in marriages where one spouse is fulfilling their role and not seeing their spouse reciprocate. So the enjoyment, the satisfaction, and the contentment is derived from your relationship with God when it's not being derived from your spouse. And that's the difference in those two principles that I've laid out there. when you're not receiving what you got into the marriage in the first place, as a part of the principles of marriage, you both love each other. You both want to spend time with each other. You want to bless each other. You want to edify each other. You want to derive enjoyment from each other. Those principles that belonged to the initiation of the marriage, if those don't continue through, it creates a difficulty in the circumstances for us to fulfill our own roles. And that's why, in some sense, I even want to push back on my own criticism of the 5 love languages to say, okay, if it helps to think in terms of the necessity and the urgency of loving your spouse by looking at it in terms of an empty love tank that is there's a crack in it, it's leaky, and so as I have that sense of urgency to fulfill the requirements for filling up that love tank, then great. But recognize that if it's unrequited, it's not reciprocated, and you're doing really, I guess you could say 95% of what spouses should be doing in the marriage, and your spouse is doing 5% of what spouses should be doing in the marriage, then that is a difficult situation to be in. And I think that's another area where the Christian worldview is so important, because in those moments when couples cannot come together on resolving that conflict, then I think it's the duty and the mission of the church to step in and be able to help out, or even the duty and the mission of the friends and the family that witnessed your marriage, to hold you accountable to the truths that you committed to in vows. But that if one person continues in an unrepentant nature to fail to fulfill their function as a spouse, then it is something that becomes a disciplinary issue where the church can step in. And if you recognize what we talked about earlier of discipline of our children is indicative of our love, then let the church love you in discipline. You haven't betrayed your spouse by bringing it to the church. You haven't gone outside the bounds of your spousal role. But there's an important concept that the church can help to step in. And if it doesn't go anywhere, then hopefully the sting of an excommunication can be helpful in correcting their behavior and bringing them back. But as Jay Adams says in one of his books, that it helps to tie up the loose ends of marriage, especially when one spouse is pursuing divorce. But if you don't do any of the discipline, you operate in a Gary Chapman kind of mentality where you operate outside the church, then you're missing the privilege and the right and the responsibility to have a church family come alongside you and your spouse and lovingly and caringly help you in that situation to try to get through to your spouse. But if he or she never changes, it's a difficult question to ask yourself and to answer. If he or she never changes, then what are you going to do in your role? Which, of course, is to keep doing your role from a biblical perspective and to glorify the Lord, who would be well pleased with his son or his daughter loving their spouse, respecting their spouse, even if it's unrequited. Here's the capstone of Dr. Chapman. Warning: understanding the 5 love languages and learning to speak the primary language of your spouse may radically affect his or her behavior. People behave differently when their emotional love tanks are full. Yes and no. Example after example comes to my mind of Christian women with unbelieving husbands who are faithful to pour into their husband's love tank without seeing any radical change in their behavior at all. However, there are certainly senses in which the atmosphere of the marriage changes, and that those women that seek to never say anything negative about their husbands, who, even in the case of the unbelievers, they do see and find the overall change of the atmosphere of the marriage, change of the way they experience the marriage for the better by fulfilling their biblical role. Now, again, I did say yes and no, because the same category of example, Christian wife with unbelieving spouse, where the Christian wife has indeed changed the behavior of even an unbelieving spouse, and has, in that sense as well, radically revolutionized the marriage. But for people who read this book that perhaps employ these principles and they don't see those effects, it's not because you're failing. It's not because you didn't effectively put into action the entirety of what Dr. Chapman is doing here. You missed a step somewhere, but it's the reality that some individuals, even while receiving God's common grace, can effectively not change their behavior at all, regardless of how fluent in their love language you are. Some people, in the slavery that they have to sin, in the blindness that they have to sin, can see and understand, well, perhaps could see without understanding, their spouse as pouring into them, speaking their love language, and it still go completely unrequited. Now, again, am I being too critical? Sure. Dr. Chapman is not saying that this is a 100% success rate, but he is, in this specific sense, saying people do behave differently when their emotional love tanks are full. That in some circumstances that couldn't be further from the truth. Now, one thing that I thought of as I was thinking more and more about the 5 love languages, and you think about the concept of the love tank, I wonder if anybody has ever said to Dr. Chapman in a counseling session, or Dr. Campbell in a counseling session, if they've brought up, well, your problem is that you have an emotional love tank, it's leaking, and you have to have it constantly filled up from an external source. I wonder if anybody had ever responded to them saying, how can I patch the love tank? How can I make it to where my love tank is not leaking? Or how can I make my love tank bigger so that way it's filled up fuller than somebody else's love tank? And even if I can't fix the patch, maybe I can fix the duration that I would go from having a full love tank to having an empty love tank. And then, of course, is there any other way, Dr. Chapman, to fill up the love tank other than trying to find that in another human being that can certainly fail to provide that opportunity for me? Now, wanted to scroll down here. Sorry if that made you a little woozy or dizzy as I was scrolling through the book here, but here's another example that I wanted to go through here, and we're kind of running a little bit short on time. I don't want to go too long in this episode, but I did want to get to this example because, again, the criticisms that I'm raising on the 5 love languages have to do with the manners in which they've been applied. And there's an example that's being given on page 40 in chapter 4, words of affirmation, one of the love languages. You have acts of service, gifts, words of affirmation, physical touch, and quality time. You have 5 love languages, and of course Dr. Chapman believes that you might have different dialects within those 5. You might be able to have a combination of the 2, or you might be like some individuals where literally every one of your love languages is all 5 of the love languages, and that just sort of is what it is. But in words of affirmation, page 40 again. If your hard copy has a different page number, I apologize that I'm having to cause you to hunt down the citation here. But let's see where it specifically starts. Got a quote here from Mark Twain. I can live for 2 months on a good compliment. If we take Twain literally, 6 compliments a year would have kept his emotional love tank at the operational level. Your spouse would probably need more. One way to express love emotionally is to use words that build up. Solomon, author of the ancient Hebrew wisdom literature, wrote, "The tongue has the power of life and death." Many couples have never learned the tremendous power of verbally affirming each other. Solomon further noted, "An anxious heart weighs a man down, but a kind word cheers up." So we have some biblical backing, but of course, in the context of the scriptures, these understandings are not understood outside of the gospel. But at any rate, these are some serious wisdom literature. These are the words of God, more than just Hebrew wisdom literature. But verbal compliments or words of appreciation are powerful communicators of love. They are best expressed in simple, straightforward statements of affirmation, such as, "You look sharp in that suit," "Do you ever look nice in that dress?" ! "Wow!" "You must be the best potato cook in the world. I love these potatoes." Come on, potato cook? That's the example that you want to give? Maybe I just have not experienced a good potato in a while. But anyway, I really appreciate your washing the dishes tonight. Thanks for getting the babysitter lined up tonight. I want you to know I don't take that for granted. I really appreciate your taking the garbage out. What would happen to the emotional climate of a marriage if the husband and wife heard such words of affirmation regularly? Now, again, this is where the clarification that I had at the beginning is so important. These are all really good things. In the subject matter of words of affirmation, many people could definitely benefit from compliments or encouragement of a verbal nature from their spouse. It can definitely go a long way. The danger, though, that is not mentioned within this subject, as far as I can remember, is that some people, in terms of their pride, might be fishing for these statements as a means of fueling their pride. So, that's where if you lack the biblical worldview, there's ways in which you understand this as being misusable to a significant detriment. But some people exist in concepts where if you told them their cooking was the best, they would respond, "No, it was terrible, it was disgusting." So then what is your response to somebody who doesn't receive your compliment by just simply saying thanks or "I appreciate that"? Who doesn't reciprocate words of affirmation when they receive words of affirmation, but that the receipt of these kinds of things boosts ego, boosts pride, and could be something that for the person who only reads the 5 love languages thinking, well, maybe they're not getting enough words of affirmation. Look at how empty their love tank is. When I give them words of affirmation, it doesn't make them feel loved. They must be on E. They must be on empty. So let me pour more words of affirmation in, and really you're feeding the sin. I think on Tuesday I'd even mentioned these are good concepts as long as you understand them in a sanctified context, where somebody is seeking to grow in their sanctification so that it's not an issue of pride, but that it's an issue of receiving these things the way that Solomon understood them to be received. Tongue is the power of life and death. An anxious heart weighs a man down, but a kind word cheers him up. So just as a word of caution that be careful in some people's lives, and it could be the case of your marriage, and think about how detrimental that would be if your spouse lives in an unsanctified, I guess we could call it an unsanctified love tank, where their love tank is intended to draw, their love language is intended to draw out your words of affirmation for the purpose of you bolstering their pride. And in that way, you're heaping a continual stumbling block towards your spouse. So And that could be true on any of the love languages. I'm only picking on this one specifically because of the fact that I wanted to look at this example before we finished here. Several years ago, I was sitting in my office with my door open. A lady walking down the hall said, "Have you got a minute?" Sure, come in. She sat down and said, "Dr. Chapman, I've got a problem. I can't get my husband to paint our bedroom. I have been after him for 9 months. I have tried everything I know, and I can't get him to paint it." My first thought was, and I appreciated this, "Lady, you're at the wrong place. I'm not a paint contractor." But I said, "Tell me about it." Certainly as a counselor, I think you would experience that kind of reaction more often than not. What do you want me to do with your unpainted bedroom? So there's some entertaining stuff in here. She said, quote, "Well, last Saturday was a good example. You remember how pretty it was? Do you know what my husband did all day long? He washed and waxed the car." So horrible. Dr. Chapman asks, "So what did you do?" She responds, "I went out there and said, 'Bob, I don't understand you. Today would have been a perfect day to paint the bedroom, and here you are washing and waxing the car.'" So did he paint the bedroom?" I inquired. "No, it's still not painted. I don't know what to do." "Let me ask you a question," I said. "Are you opposed to clean, waxed cars?" It's a good question. "No, but I want the bedroom painted." "Are you certain that your husband knows that you want the bedroom painted?" "I know he does," she said. "I've been after him for 9 months. Of course, I'm embellishing on this. I'm inflecting on it as how I could understand this conversation going. "Let me ask you one more question. Does your husband ever do anything good?" I think that's really, in my mind, kind of a turning point in this discussion. Because it certainly is a tendency and a propensity for any spouse, I'm sure, to examine the circumstances of their marriage and major on the negative. And so that's a very good, important question to ask. Does your husband ever do anything good? Like what? Oh, like taking the garbage out, or getting bugs off the windshield of your car you drive, or putting gas in the car, or paying the electric bill, or hanging up his coat. Yes, she said, he does some of those things. Then I have 2 suggestions. 1, don't ever mention painting the bedroom again. I repeated, don't ever mention it again. And she said, I don't see how that's going to help. Look, you just told me that he knows that you want the bedroom painted. You don't have to tell him anymore. He already knows. The second suggestion I have is that the next time your husband does anything good, give him a verbal compliment. If he takes the garbage out, say, Bob, I want you to know that I really appreciate your taking the garbage out. Don't say, about time you took the garbage out. The flies were going to carry it out for you. Yes, please don't say that. That's horrendous. If you see him paying the electric bill, put your hand on his shoulder and say, Bob, I really appreciate your paying the electric bill. I hear there are husbands who don't do that, and I want you to know how much I appreciate it. Every time he does anything good, give him a verbal compliment. I don't see how that's going to get the bedroom painted. I said, you asked for my advice. You have it. It's free. Again, I had mentioned actually the things that I would compliment in this book on Tuesday's program. And that's certainly another area that imbibes the counseling sessions. You asked for my advice. There it is. I'm not charging you for it. So very, very appreciative of that. She wasn't very happy with me when she left. 3 weeks later, however, she came back to my office and said, it worked. She had learned that verbal compliments are far greater motivators than nagging words. I'm not suggesting verbal flattery in order to get your spouse to do something you want, even though he just did. There's the issue. There's part of the reason why I'm drawing out this example here. The object of love is not getting something you want, but doing something for the well-being of the one you love. Agreed. Couldn't agree more. It is a fact, however, that when we receive affirming words, we are far more likely to be motivated to reciprocate and do something our spouse desires. Agreed. But here's where the issue lies with this example. Imagine if Bob here comes back after painting the bedroom and says, hey, what was the change? And this woman says, well, what do you mean? What was the change? And he says, well, I mean, you had been very negative towards me, and for 9 months you'd been nagging me, and I haven't seen you doing the things that you've been doing in terms of putting your hand on my shoulder and saying, thank you for doing that. I really appreciate you paying the electric bill. I hear there are husbands who don't do that, and I want you to know how much I appreciate it. If she's honest with him on why she changed, then she would respond, I got so fed up with you not painting the bedroom that I went and sought counsel for how I could get you to paint the bedroom. And I engaged in Pavlov's dog's response, where I would give you a cookie here and there for the things that you did in order to motivate you to do what I really wanted you to do. And that what I really was interested in was not my husband painting the bedroom, but having the bedroom painted. Dr. Chapman rebuts, I'm not suggesting verbal flattery in order to get your spouse to do something you want. The whole point of why she came in for counseling was to get her husband to do what she wanted. 3 weeks later, however, she came back to my office and said it worked. So I think what's more transcendent, what aligns more with a Christian worldview, is in this example, number one, Bob should have been talked to. And Bob should have understood that his wife was wanting him to do something, and it is not outside the bounds of his leadership, it is not outside the bounds of his masculinity to do something that his wife wants him to do. However, there is a disdain for her husband's hobby, washing and waxing a car. That's why I do appreciate the fact that he says, are you opposed to clean, waxed cars? However, there's a step further that should have been taken. This is your husband's activity. Do you respect that? This is his hobby. Do you respect that? Right now, there's enough information presented from their interaction to show she did not respect his hobby. His hobby is not a sin, unless if it's determined from examination that washing and waxing a car is actually his idolatry, and in which case the biblical worldview, he could be confronted and shown why idolatry is counter-distinctive to his relationship with God, how he is missing out on aspects and elements of his relationship with God in terms of enjoyment and glorification being given to God because he's engaging in idolatry. Otherwise, it is what it's represented as being, a hobby. And 9 months going by is an incredible period of time. And again, I appreciated the fact that he said, your husband knows that you want him to paint the bedroom. That's a good thing. But then the counsel of advice that should have been given to her, that should have motivated her, is your husband is more important than a painted bedroom. However, you don't have to be silent about this, but that you can engage in respectful, qualitative discussion with your husband about it, asking questions like, sweetheart, would it be helpful for you if we went outside to get a contractor or a painter to come in and take care of this? Husband, can I help by getting paint supplies ready? When would you find a good opportunity for this to take place? Or in the subject matter of thank him for taking out the garbage, getting bugs off your windshield, That's the activity that should have been encouraged to do regardless of whether or not it works. That her consistent activity as a wife is to value, love, and respect her husband, to be content with the fact that her husband has not done what she was ultimately wanting him to do, but that if it's causing an issue in their marriage, that Bob should be talked to, and that she should be instructed and encouraged in her contentment, but as well as her contribution in the communication that can be given. Is there something that I can do to help? Is there a way that we can get around this so that way it gets accomplished? Sweetheart, you're the man for the job. We're in the chapter of words of affirmation. Honey, you're the man for the job. I don't trust anybody else doing it. It would mean a lot to me for you to do it. And maybe those are all things that she had said in this 9 months, but that was not focused on in the counseling session. How did you ask him these things? Were you respectful in asking him these things? But again, it's, you have this huge inconsistency of, I'm not suggesting verbal flattery in order to get your spouse to do what you want, and yet that's exactly what took place. A love language was offered as a tool and a tactic to manipulate the behavior of somebody's husband. And there's so much more that could have been given, that should have been given, that wasn't given. And so with those concepts in mind, recognize how it is that from a biblical worldview, words of affirmation can certainly be used. If your husband feels like those are beneficial, those are things that should have been done anyway, should have been participated in anyway, and that there should be a degree of contentment where some of these material things do not become more important than the relationship itself. I understand that there are issues that are important and that many spouses find these kinds of activities like painting a bedroom to be important. But if you have a choice, if you have an opportunity to choose between two things, the bedroom getting painted or peace in the marriage, then you would choose peace in the marriage. And I understand the response. Sometimes that would go hand in hand. I get it. I understand. But at the same time, if we have that hierarchy of the value of the relationship above and beyond the value of material things, that's important. But also, too, from the perspective that, Bob, somebody needs to talk to the dude and instruct him and encourage him and let him know, even in a loving confrontation, why are you disregarding your wife? And this is where that psychological jargon comes back into play, because this happens in relationships where they start in adolescence because that category is allowed to exist. And then you get into these circumstances where a work ethic, a biblical work ethic even, has not been instilled. A maturity issue has not been instilled. And so it's more important to focus upon, as a man, if your wife is wanting you to do something, communicate back. At what point, I'm trying to look through here again, where Bob ever gave an answer. Did he say, yes, I'll do it? Because if he did so, his yes needs to be yes and his no needs to be no, and he needs to be held accountable for those issues. Did he say no? Did he give a reason? Now, certainly Dr. Chapman may just be providing information to illustrate and to buttress and to support his presentation of the 5 love languages, and maybe there was a ton that went on in that conversation. I'm willing to grant the benefit of the doubt. But again, part of the issue is the fact that Gary Chapman has this huge platform. He's got tons of people that would read this, and if it's taken out of context, then there's problems on how people can interpret this or arrive at conclusions on this, and that's a fundamental problem. that does happen in Christian literature as well. That does happen in other books, where if you only give snippets of examples and you don't help to really round off the point and the goal of why you're providing those examples and accurately representing them in their context, then it could be something that could create some harm and create some problems. But, I mean, did he say yes? Did he say no? And then again, don't ever mention the bedroom again. Well, certainly that could be good advice. That could be helpful. But again, I go back to that issue. Sweetheart, you've been so nice to me. Why have you been so nice to me? What caused the change? Well, I went to Dr. Chapman and told him that you weren't doing what I wanted you to do, and so he told me to start complimenting you in these other areas. And I was thrilled when I found out that it worked. So, much more stuff that we could cover, but we're running. I try to keep these at about an hour or so, but if we need to go a little bit longer and I have the time to do it, I certainly don't mind, especially if it's helpful or if it's beneficial to people watching and listening, or listening to this at a later time. But these are a few of the issues to draw out. There might be more opportunity to go through more examples in the book, The 5 Love Languages. But hopefully these help to create things in a greater perspective, in a better light, and hopefully that was beneficial to you. Probably be back next Tuesday, and hopefully I can get to what I had promised on Hebrews chapter 8, verse 9, and why biblically I understand the New Testament to be citing from the Septuagint. I'm even getting emails from this brother now as we speak. And one of the things that I thought was just fascinating is the whole scholarly approach that I apparently have versus the biblical approach that he thinks that he has. But then in a recent email that he had sent me saying that P52, one of the earliest Greek manuscripts that we have, it's a very small manuscript. It in the small number of words that it has, those words are identical to the King James Version. And they're not. They're just not. So we continue to have continued misrepresentations and misunderstandings from this individual that it's just amazing to me. I hope that I never get to that position where I'm just so clueless on the things that I'm saying and so stubborn that I refuse to be corrected. But be that as it may, we'll plug right along. Thank you all for watching. Thank you for listening at any time and at any point that you're watching or listening to this program. And God bless, and we'll see you guys soon.